Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all again. I'll be with you. So we are. The purpose of these lectures is to set the scene, to set the historical situation into which the Son of God became man 2000 plus years ago. And just to recap, you remember that the Maccabees, the so-called hammers of the Greek rule in Palestine, had succeeded in restoring their own rule to the Promised Land from the Greeks. And the Jewish family called the Hasmoneans, after one of the Maccabees, Simon Hasmoneus, he was called. It was his family that ruled Palestine after the Maccabees, after the people that fought in the Jewish war. But the tragedy was that the Maccabees had been so insistent on restoring the purity of Jewish life and practice to Palestine, the descendants of those very Maccabees largely ended up conforming to the Greek way of life because of the power of the political situation, wanted to agree with it and not to be distinctively Jewish. But among ordinary Jews, think about the Jews in the countryside and the villages around Jerusalem, and these were conservatives and they wanted to live a Jewish way of life. And because of this resistance of the people to the rule of these Greek rulers who were Jews but were conforming to a Greek way of life, all this caused division and weakness, basically, among the Jews. So that when the time came, the new power of Rome was able to exploit this weakness in Palestine and to absorb Palestine into its own Roman Empire, the growing power of Rome, which was gradually increasing its empire. Ultimately, at this time, around about this time, it was conquering our own country, Britain. Julius Caesar was coming to Britain and conquering us in this period. And it was happening in Judea as well. Romans normally ruled the countries that they conquered through the ruling classes of the people that they conquered, so that they could get the agreement and acceptance of the people generally to Roman rule. So they ruled normally through the ruling classes of the country they'd conquered. And as we saw last time, this worked reasonably well. Wasn't perfect, but it worked reasonably well under the man called Herod the Great. There are quite a few Herods at this time. This is the first Herod, and he's called Herod the Great. And he's called great because he was quite successful. He was a great diplomat at ruling the kingdom of Palestine for the Romans, because he kept the Romans happy by maintaining order in the country and making the country comparatively prosperous. And he also worked not only to keep the Romans happy, but to keep the Jews happy as well by rebuilding the temple, making the temple the most magnificent structure probably in the ancient world, following Greek architectural practice and making a very, very beautiful building. They used to talk about the doors of the temple that were plated in solid gold, so that when the sun came up, the sun was reflected on these doors, and created a magnificent spectacle. It took years and years and years to do this rebuilding of the temple, still going on during Jesus' time on earth. And as we all know, he, just before his passion, he went into the temple and said, you see all these beautiful buildings, these beautiful carvings, the beautiful ornamentation of the temple. All this is going to be destroyed. There will not be one stone laying on another. The building was still going on at that time. Went on, as I said last time, until I think 64 AD, so 30 years after the crucifixion. And it was completed in 64 AD. So a huge building project, one of the greatest building projects of the ancient world, all initiated by Herod the Great. He didn't live to see it completed because he died in 4 BC, but his sons carried it on. Now, in his will, Herod the Great divided the kingdom of Palestine between his 3 sons. These sons were called, the first was called Archelaus, the second was called Herod Antipas, and the third was called Herod Philip. Now, these names ring bells in our heads in terms of the New Testament, because it's Philip that is involved in John the Baptist, his beheading, and his wife, and John the Baptist confronting Herod Antipas for having married his brother Philip's wife. So these are the people that we're talking about, mentioned in the Gospels. But anyway, to go back to Herod the Great, his will is confirmed by the Emperor Augustus. Again, he's mentioned in the Gospel of Luke as decreeing a census, Matthew, decreeing a census that Joseph and Mary have to go up to be registered. It's Augustus that does that. So Augustus confirmed Herod's will, but he denied to his sons the title of king. Herod would be called King Herod the Great. His sons, by decree of the emperor, would be denied that temple because he didn't want them being focuses of independence from Roman rule. So you got 3 rulers in Palestine now, territory divided between them. But the same problem that the people had with Herod the Great continued with them. They acted in conformity with Greek customs, Greek lifestyles. And again, this caused great resentment among the Jews of the time, particularly in highly populated Jewish areas. In Palestine, there were areas of mixed populations. Well, it was okay in those areas that these rulers were behaving and following Greek customs, but in highly Jewish concentrated areas like Jerusalem, there was a huge amount of resentment towards these rulers. That the people were just saying, well, you're just puppets for Roman rule. You're not being faithful to the law. You're not being faithful to God. You are simply political operators. So lots of resentment created because of this, because they're trying to please the Romans. They're not pleasing the people. All this is causing tension, and a powder keg is being created. Very tense time in history. And the ruler of Jerusalem at this time was the eldest son, Archelaus. And he was so unable to rule as his father had done, being diplomatic and trying to keep the peace, trying to please the Romans and the Jews at the same time. He wasn't as good as his father had been at that. He only managed to reign in Jerusalem for 10 years. And his rule was so bad that the Roman Emperor Augustus intervened and replaced him with And again, another name that is very familiar to us from the Gospels comes up now. He replaced him by a Roman procurator who would rule directly from Rome. So the Jewish rule is ended in Jerusalem at that time in 6 AD. So 6 years after, round about 6 years after Jesus. We're not absolutely certain which year Jesus was actually born, although they worked it out pretty accurately. But it's round this time that Archelaus is mentioned in the Gospel. So Jerusalem is ruled under the system of government of the procurator throughout, more or less, Jesus' time on earth. The procurator is in power during his passion. Who is the procurator? Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was procurator from 26 AD for 10 years to 36 AD. The system of government of procurators was a failure because the Roman procurators were insensitive to Jewish religious customs, behaving tactlessly. It's like going into Jerusalem now and not observing religious sensibilities now. It creates a powder keg. If you go into the Muslim quarter and you behave in a certain way, you've got to be very careful. Highly sensitive, volatile political region. You've got to be very careful how you behave. The Romans were not. They behaved tactlessly and provocatively even. Pontius Pilate took the Roman military emblems that they carried in battle, the standards, into Jerusalem, highly insensitive. And in order to build an aqueduct to channel a good public project, but he plundered the Jewish temple, the treasury of the temple, to pay for this aqueduct to be constructed. This caused an enormous amount of resentment. So much so that riots ensued. Riots were a common feature throughout the time the procurators were ruling in Jerusalem. And we can understand, as the Gospels say, why Pilate was so afraid of riots during Jesus' passion. Riots were common during the great religious festivals of the Jewish year, like the Passover. And he knew that very easily a riot could ensue because of how the people were feeling about Jesus. And that was one of the factors that forced him into giving Jesus into their hands for him to be killed. The riots were always suppressed by the Romans extremely brutally. So a highly volatile, tense, violent time in Jerusalem during Jesus' life on earth. Ideally, the Romans would have succeeded much better in Jerusalem if they had been able to follow their normal policy of ruling through a local ruling family, which would have been the Hasmoneans in this case. But the Jews didn't trust the Hasmoneans. They said they were just puppets. They didn't trust the Pharisees. So the Romans had to send in a procurator and rule directly from Rome in order to keep order. And the riots were often led by men who had messianic claims. They claimed to be the Messiah. Jesus is not the only person who is claiming to be the Messiah, because the people were in expectation of the Messiah coming at any time. So other people were claiming to be that as well and gathering men around them to fight the Romans, to get the Romans out. to get control back of Palestine to themselves. And again, every rebellion that came up, the Romans reacted by harsh suppression. This went on through all the period of the procurators. A huge powder keg was there, waiting to explode, and it did finally in 66 AD, so 30 years after the Passion of Jesus, the crucifixion, 33 years afterwards, it did in the so-called Jewish War, which lasted from 66 to 73 AD. The thing that had caused it initially was that again, the temple treasury had been plundered by the procurator, the last procurator, who was called Gessius Florus. And this produced such a huge riot that it forced, the Jews were so riotous that the Romans were forced to actually abandon Palestine because the whole country was in uproar. And particularly the city, and this rebellion turned into an outright national war, the Jewish War. Initially, the Jews were very successful in this war. The Romans sent in the military commander that was commanding Syria, the country next to them, which was at peace. And they sent in a huge Roman army against the Jews to quell the war, to win the war. But the Jews fought back, and like the Maccabees, they threw them out. They didn't win. The Roman Emperor, Nero, who's the emperor now, saw how serious the situation was and sent in the central Roman army to deal with the situation under the general called Vespasian to end the war. He got the north of the country under control first, Galilee, remember where the Sermon on the Mount and all Jesus' major preaching is taken in Galilee. Well, this is 36 years later now, but he got Galilee under control by 68 AD. But then Vespasian was made emperor. So he was elected emperor, so he had to go back to Rome, and he delegated the conduct of the war to his son Titus, who took over. In 70 AD, Titus, Vespasian's son, laid siege to Jerusalem. And it was a terrible, terrible siege. It went on and on and on, so that the inhabitants of Jerusalem, there's even cannibalism going on in the city because there's no food, there's no water. And the Jews were literally eating each other. They were so hungry. It was a terrible, terrible time. And ultimately, the siege broke into the city, through the city walls, and Titus went in and destroyed the temple for a second time. Remember, it had been destroyed by the Assyrians. Now it was destroyed by the Romans under Titus. And he took the rest of the treasures from the temple, particularly the 7-branch candlestick that they call the menorah candlestick. If you go to Rome now, the arch of Titus is there, and there's a carving on that arch which shows the Romans taking the menorah candlestick back to Rome as booty from Rome. But the Jews carried on fighting even after Jerusalem had been captured, and they retreated to the fortress, the mountain fortress that Herod had built. Herod the Great had built. It's a place called Masada up in the mountains, and they retreated there. And they fought from there up until 73, another 3 years, they fought there tooth and nail against the Romans. And they never actually surrendered, because all the inhabitants of the fortress, the garrison that Herod the Great had built, committed suicide rather than submit to Roman rule. But that was the end, definitively, of Jewish rule in Palestine for the next 1,900 years. It was only after the Second World War, when the State of Israel was created, the Jews returned to Palestine to rule that country in their own right again. So that is the situation that Jesus was born into. What do we learn from it? Well, we learn that compromising is not always the best policy. If you try to please two people at the same time, the Romans and the Jews, all you create is more tension. The Jews were missing the opportunity. God was visiting his people because they were so taken up with the Roman occupation and finding political freedom for themselves. They missed the visitation of God. Jesus came along and was preaching in a way that was completely in opposition to what the Jews were wanting at that time. They wanted political freedom. What does Jesus come along and say? Blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So a message that is completely contrary to what the Jews are expecting their Messiah, who they see being a political figure who will lead them to freedom from Roman oppression. Jesus is not like that. They miss the opportunity. And that's why Jesus weeps over Jerusalem and says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, would that you had seen your opportunity when it came. How I would have loved to have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not. So great tragedy, great tragedy. But out of all this terror and violence and comes the church. Next time we're going to start looking at the New Testament. We're going to look at the setting of the New Testament and Jesus' entry into the world. So God bless you. Talk to you next time on Friday. Bye for now.
Thank you very much, Father.
Thank you, Father John.